All right, so our last class was to talk about factors, biotic factors and abiotic factors that would influence an organism's survival. And we're going to keep talking about factors today, but instead of just talking about what the factors are, we are going to talk about this word, how. So one of the things I said would be the most important in this section is if you could explain why something is going to affect an organism's survival. So we're going to just discuss that particular idea in a little bit more detail. So I put a little reminder here of what some of the factors are. And most of these we mentioned in one of our lists yesterday: water availability, temperature, food availability. Those would generally be abiotic factors. Disease and predators would be examples of biotic factors. And the idea is that increases, and we could say, or decreases in these factors, depending on what they are, would restrict the range and distribution of population. Now, when we say range and distribution, we are talking about where. Where do they live? Do they live in a particular place? Yes or no? And the reason they would live in a particular place or not is probably because of one of these biotic or abiotic factors. And the key idea is this one here. Organisms only exist within the range of tolerance to the resources that support them. And so I'm going to explain a little bit what I mean by tolerance. There are two graphs here. The one on the left is a specific example, and the one on the right is a very generic thing that doesn't have any actual data on it. But these two graphs are going to explain the word tolerance to you. Now, if I take a look at the graph on the left, I can see that I'm comparing the temperature on the bottom with the growth rate on the side. So that would be like the growth of their population, how many organisms there are, for three different kinds of fish: trout, perch, and bass. And for all three of them, I get sort of a bell-shaped curve. If you're going to go to post-secondary, you will learn about the bell curve and how it can help you and hinder you. But a bell curve is a graph that has a peak in the middle and then goes down on both sides. Now, on the right, we have a very generic graph that explains what is going on in this bell-shaped curve that we see on the graph for temperature and growth rate. The part in the middle, that's the peak, the top, the big bump, the hill, this is what we would call optimum tolerance. So I'm just writing it a bit bigger so that if you can't see it clearly, you can. But this is the optimum tolerance range. That means that in this section of the graph, whatever characteristic we're comparing, organisms like it. If we're at this level of this particular characteristic, it is good for organisms. So on this graph, I would say that these sections here would all be part of the optimum tolerance range. So if I interpret what the graph is saying to me, the growth rate of rainbow trout is optimum, sort of between these 2 points. Maybe let's say 2 and 18 degrees Celsius approximately, if I'm estimating off of my graph. That's their optimum tolerance range. That means that in that set of temperatures, the most of them will grow. On the outside, we have another section where it's still part of the curve, but it's where the curve has gotten really low. This section is called the stress zone. And you'll see there's a stress zone on both sides of the curve. That's indicating that if whatever environmental condition we're measuring, in this case temperature, gets too high or gets too low, less organisms can survive. So for all of my fish, their stress zones would be the ends of these lines. So for rainbow perch, or rainbow trout, their stress zone would be this little section here, maybe between 0 and 2. And this section up here, maybe between 18 and 20. So there are temperatures where they could still survive, but less of them will survive. So it's called the stress zone. And then outside of that, there's actually nothing on the graph. The line is flat. I'm just adding that in there so you could see what I'm talking about. There is a zone that we call the zone of intolerance. If you've ever used the word tolerance, maybe in social or religion, you would know that being intolerant means you do not accept something. So if an organism is intolerant of their environment, it means they can't handle it. They would not survive. So for rainbow trout, their zone of intolerance would be anything less than 0 and anything higher than 20 degrees. That is when there would not be any of the organism present. So if I look at the graph here, there are many organisms in the optimum tolerance, few in the stress zone, and there are none in the zone of intolerance. So this idea of optimum stress and intolerance would be a way that you could explain how a factor is influencing how many organisms there are and where they are living. Now, does anyone want to ask any questions about the graph? I would, if I was a teacher who made Biology 20 things that you had to hand in to me, put something about a graph like this on, say, a quest. Like maybe this thing that we'll do on Thursday where I'll give you a context to read and ask you questions about it. I would ask you about this type of a graph. So to describe the optimum tolerance, stress zone, zone of intolerance. So I'm going to pause here. So we're talking about a factor that would affect the number and distribution of human beings. And so I'm going to put amount of caffeine available. Now I'm being sort of silly here, but it's so that I could put some actual numbers on it and maybe you could get an analogy out of it. Maybe some of you don't drink caffeinated beverages, and so for this would be, your graph would be different than my graph. But I'm going to illustrate this as if it were me, and what would be my optimum values for all of these things. So I'm going to start at the sort of end of my graph, which I'll just fix up a little bit here. I'm going to start at the edge of the graph over here. This would be 0 cups of caffeinated beverages. That would be where my zone of intolerance starts. So what I'm saying is, if I went less than 0, I cannot tolerate that. I would not survive with with 0 or less cups of coffee. Over here, we're going to say 5. If I were to have more than 5 caffeinated beverages, that is where I will start to probably have heart palpitations or some sort of stress-induced panic. So those would be my intolerance zones. I can't handle that. Now in the stress zone, which would be on either side, I'm going to put values that I could handle, but that would not be ideal for me. So in the stress zone over here, I would say that anywhere between 0 and 1 would be my stress zone. So if I don't even get to have 1 entire cup of coffee, that is stressful, and I do not survive well. And we'll put 4 over here for the stress zone on the other side. That means that anywhere in this middle part, would be my optimum amount of caffeinated beverages. That is the amount that would allow a population made up of me to survive the best. Sure. So, for people who perhaps do not enjoy caffeinated beverages, your graph might be a different shape. So you're saying you don't drink caffeinated beverages. Pop is caffeinated. Okay, so then maybe your graph is actually higher than mine. So for someone who drinks pop and coffee and 5-Hour Energy and Monster energy drinks and that kind of stuff, your graph might actually be over here. It might be shifted to the right because you prefer more. And for those of you who do not enjoy caffeinated beverages, maybe your graph actually looks like this. So notice how it's like half of the curve, and that's because your optimum range is to have almost none, and the more you have, the worse it gets. So it's possible, because this is 0, that your curve doesn't actually fit all the way on the graph because that's a bad condition for you. So I just wanted to illustrate how we could use these words optimum stress and intolerance with a different kind of characteristic. So I'm going to go back to the page that's in your notes here. So I just wanted to remind you of some things that would be biotic factors that would limit an organism's range. We're talking about where they live. So factors like competition, predators, and parasites should all reduce the number of organisms that are able to survive in a particular area. So I'm picking things that are bad. In our last lesson, some of the factors weren't necessarily ones that were bad. Some of them could have been good. But these are all ones that are limiting. So they would reduce the number of organisms that survive. So competition, in this example, there's a bunch of kinds of trout. Predators, now the Arctic fox is an example of an introduced predator, and that's something we talk about in biology a lot. If you were to bring an organism into an ecosystem where they didn't naturally live, that can have a huge impact on the things that live there. And then over here we have parasites. I mentioned the other day about ticks and how I had one and how it got removed from my leg. But other examples would be things like a leech, a flea, or a louse, which is the singular of lice, like head lice. Those are all parasites. And those all generally are biotic factors that would reduce the number of organisms, so that would put them into their stress zone or their zone of intolerance. Now, if you go to the next slide that's actually in your notes, these are some abiotic factors that could limit the number of organisms that live in a particular area. The first thing that we should mention is this idea of average weather. That's what climate is. Average weather is usually calculated by considering temperature and rainfall. In general, less of either of those equals smaller populations. Organisms like water, organisms like warmth. So there's a picture here that shows a bunch of different types of ecosystems. Some of these you might remember learning in previous grades of science, and I'm not asking you to memorize them, but I'm just asking you to recognize, for example, that down here on this graph is where there is a lot of precipitation and where the temperature is high. This would be your tropical rainforest type place. So it's very humid and it's very warm. And this is the type of place that has the largest number of populations. So we're saying that the better the weather, basically, the more populations there are. And as soon as we start taking away precipitation or taking away heat, then there would be fewer and fewer and fewer of a given population that would live anywhere. So as I go this way, or as I go this way, I'm going to reduce the number of organisms because I'm limiting the weather conditions. They have less warmth and they have less rainfall. Now, there are abiotic factors other than just the weather that could influence things. For example, things that have to do with the soil would have a huge impact on plants, if we're talking about those. So this example here is from southern Alberta. That's Fort Macleod on the picture there. And there are a type of tree called a cottonwood tree that live on the banks of the river. And whenever changes happen to the flow of the river, it will affect whether or not these cottonwood trees have water, and that affects the size of their population. So we're still talking about biotic and abiotic factors, but now we're just talking about how. How is it going to affect the size of a population? And we're really focusing on the population being smaller. Now there's a couple of words that we need to define. Two of them are habitat and range, because we need to distinguish between the two. Habitat is where we talk about the specific conditions that they live in. Like it needs to be warm or very humid or have a particular amount of nitrogen available in the soil. Whereas range is talking about something geographic. In other words, the way I would describe where they are on a map. So I've given you an example here to illustrate the difference between habitat and range. In the first part, I'm talking about snow leopards. I'm talking about them in both parts. But I talk about actual names of countries that they are living in. That is their range. That's telling me where, geographically, I could locate them. In the second part, I'm talking about altitude, and I'm giving some actual measurements. This is a characteristic. And knowing this characteristic would be a way to describe their specific habitat. So range is on a map, habitat is based on a characteristic. We don't actually have to name a particular place. We just have to say something about their environment. And then the word that goes along with habitat and range is the word niche. Now we've already used this word before when we talked about an organism's trophic level, like where they are in the food chain or what they do. That was another way of representing their niche. And the idea here is that species can share habitat and range if they do not have the same niche, because then they won't be in competition with each other. So I'm going to highlight these couple of birds that are on here. These two birds have the same habitat and the same range, right? They're living on the same tree next to the same body of water. But one of them hunts during the day and the other one hunts at night. Since they are not hunting at the same time, they're not in direct competition for resources. In addition, the things that you could hunt during the day and the things that you could hunt at night would be different. So habitat and range could be the same for two organisms as long as their niche is different. There's also a human on here. We could exist in this same ecosystem because we have different requirements for survival than those two birds do. And at the same time, there's this organism, it's a sea cow. It doesn't hunt, it eats plants. So it's not interfering with the two birds because they're not sharing a food source. So as long as their niche or role is different, and usually here we are talking about their trophic level in the food chain that they are in, as long as that is different, then organisms can occupy the same habitat or the same range.